My cousin, Chris Mellon, they just didn't pick this guy out of a hat. The Mellon family is a small committee of 300 ruling financial families of this country. Now, you can research that on your own. As far as what these bloodlines mean, they mean something to someone. Later on, I asked my dad at the end of his life, I said, I'm going to go forward. And he's like, I urge you to, because your cousin Chris is not telling the truth. He's lying by omission. And when they get up there in 2017, say, this is a mystery. He is lying to the world, him and Louis Elizondo. Bald-faced lie.
So now I want to get into unpack some details. It's sort of a summary, what we're going to see here next on the screen. But I just want to go through so you get a gestalt of what the world and national security implications of these illegal secret projects are. They are unconstitutional dangers, serious ones, of targeting these ET craft. I know for a fact these have been connected to systems that are in space, on the Earth, under the water, and on airborne aircraft that can track and target and down or stun extraterrestrial vehicles. This is very dangerous business. As you know from Mr. Schratt's work, we have 121 crash retrieval cases. Those things just didn't drop out of the sky because they ran out of jet fuel A. They were downed. And so this sort of business is really dangerous because these civilizations are not hostile, but they're quite advanced, and you can only push through that kind of behavior for so long. The second is that this group is withholding the benefits of energy, free energy, and the destruction of constitutional democracy and the rule of law. The rule of law, if the United States, Europe, and every intelligent country in the world knew what we had technologically, they would not be spending trillions of dollars on carbon capture and halfway measures like wind and solar. We would have something that would fit on this podium that would run this building with no pollution, no radiation, and at zero energy costs. And by the way, a senior executive with a major Fortune 100 corporation has told us they have had it for decades. He wants to come forward, but he and his whole family have been threatened with being executed. This was last month. So what we have to do is figure out, okay, we're going to pull this forward, we're going to change all that. The other issue here is these unsupervised use of illegal projects have been used, and you're going to see this in a moment, in false flag operations, but these are called deceptive indications and warnings, but in the Pentagon are false indications and warnings, and they have been deceiving the legal government and the Pentagon, such as this Tic Tac episode we're going to get to in a moment. Here's the news flash. That was hours from the Lockheed Skunk Works. The psychological warfare operations began in the late 50s, mid to late 50s, include the abductions of innocent humans, animal mutilations, and the creation of a false alien threat. As Werner von Braun told Carol Rosin, this is what their long-term plan was to unite the world around a militaristic system globally, with the idea that there was a alien threat the world would unite against and fight, like the movie Independence Day, which is, of course, why that was made. The illegal UFO-related projects, therefore, are an existential threat to human civilization. This is why Eisenhower warned about it. This is why the director of the CIA at the time of, right after Roswell, said the secrecy around UFOs is a threat to the national security. He never said the UFOs were, because at that time, when he was working, we didn't have them. Now, if he knew this, that this covert and rogue illegal secret government had these assets and were using them in these sort of operations, he would be even more concerned. So how is this done, though? One of the questions I always get from whether it's a member of Congress or someone in the media, because they want to relegate this to a conspiracy theory. Have you noticed the left and the right, if they don't agree with you, you're a conspiracy theorist, right? That's the new smear for anyone you don't agree with, no matter what side of the political spectrum. But let's go to this next slide. Here's how it's been enforced and created. Next. I love this quote from Mr. Kissinger. The illegal we do immediately. The unconstitutional takes a little longer. He would know because he's been on the senior committee dealing with this issue. Next. He's still living. And this one, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Now, why did I include that from Voltaire? Because if they can convince the US government, factions in the Pentagon, and the people that there's an alien threat for us to fight, then you can commit every kind of atrocity under that false narrative and false flag. Very dangerous, but very effective. Next. And this.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And you know, Kennedy made a very similar speech, and a more lengthy speech after this. Why? Because both of them had been denied access eventually. Eisenhower was read in early on, and then they circled the wagons and moved him out of the way. As you know from the attorney, Stephen Lufkin, the original Disclosure Project attorney, who has passed away. He was in the White House with Eisenhower. If you read the disclosure book, I mean, I know nobody reads. It's so unfashionable to read or do math. Anyway, that's my social commentary for the hour. I may be politically correct to read or do math. I'm not sure. Anyway, so the reality of it is that all happened at that period. That was the inflection point where the power within this military-industrial hybrid got up and left the oversight of the presidency and the Congress, and it has not been under proper supervision since then, late 1950s. And let's listen to this. Don't take my word for it. This is Senator Daniel Inouye.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
Free from the law itself. That was in the 80s. They're in the Iran-Contra and Broglio. However, you're going to hear from our attorney. He met with Inouye after the Disclosure Project, and Inouye confirmed what we had said on May 9th, 2001 is all true. And we have a signed affidavit notarized from this attorney that you will see and he will share when he gets here in a few hours. Now, the funding mechanism that he refers to, how is that? The very first question I got asked a while back in a skiff was, where is money coming from? How? Because this one gentleman that was there oversees the black budget of the United States and the three-letter agencies. If he was in the military, it'd be equivalent of a 2 or 3-star general still, but he's on the civilian end. And so what you have to understand is that what you learn from Mr. Schratt, there are all kinds of creative accounting. You know, where to ship a bolt somewhere, they charge $1 million or something crazy. And the government says, oh, okay, rubber stamp it. I talked to a KPMG auditor looking at my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman. And when they were looking for a lot of missing money, they said, well, that's TSS. You don't have a clearance to know where we spent that. And so they rubber stamp an account, goes back to the White House and the Congress, and they're busy with 1,000 other things, and they just slip it out the door through the back. And I think you have to understand this happens across the contracting sector, what's called WFO, work for others. And when I met in 1993 at the Wrigley Mansion with a committee of these corporate folks, they said, oh, yes. You know, and I was about ready to brief the CIA director. This is in the fall of 1993. He just flat out said, this executive, you don't need to brief the president or the CIA director. They don't know anything, and I'm quoting, they're not going to know anything. You should be talking to people like us. Now, I thought the guy lost his mind, but they were for real. And he offered a different bribe than I got from General Stubblebine. He said, you have very good credit as a doctor. So you can take out as many platinum credit cards as you want. We will zero them down each month. You spend millions of dollars a month. We'll zero them out because we're in the architecture of the banking system. And we run the supercomputers that back up all those systems. And when there's a trade between the yen and the dollar, there's something less than a penny, they grab it, it goes into a black fund. Trillions of dollars in transaction daily, even a fraction of a cent, you do the math. All right? Okay. So, that, when he told me that, I went, very creative, very smart, very sub rosa, you'd never know what's going on by these folks. And of course, I mentioned these companies here. There's a much bigger list that are doing embezzlement. So let's say we have a project, the B-2 stealth bomber. They build a government, whatever, $2 billion a company. A copy actually costs $150 million. Where's the rest going? Out the back door. And we're going to have someone you're going to see in a minute, one of our disclosure project witnesses, who saw this happening at SAIC. So, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, the Phantom Works at Boeing, EG&G, Booz Allen Hamilton, SAIC, General Electric, there's a bunch of them. And this is, of course, multiple federal accounts of embezzlement of federal funds, period, no question. But see, you're going to have forensic accountants to tear this apart. I mentioned, of course, yesterday, the cash trade in illegal drugs and weapons, as well as other contraband, that creates a cash untraceable revenue flow. Our recent witness, who not too many years ago was at the Dugway Proving Grounds, was told by an Air Force woman there that all transactions at that sector, Avery, A-V-E-R-Y sector, were in cash, cold, hard cash, all of it. Where are they getting it? Right here. And then there's illegal exploitation of the patents. Now, what does this mean? I have a whistleblower who worked for quite some time on the Nellis Range in Area 51, and they would have meetings to determine what they were studying from extraterrestrial sources would be okay now to figure out how they work and monetize through the conventional system, where it be material management, special alloys, integrated circuits, fiber optics, and what have you. And this is still going on, okay? Now listen to this. Don't take my word about this missing money.
Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
That was 22 years ago. Now that's the Secretary of Defense. They estimate now it's much more than that. Catherine Austin Fitts is estimating it's around $22 trillion. Our entire national debt is $32 trillion. So perhaps up to 2/3 of that debt could be resolved by this problem right here, what we're talking about. It's an enormous amount of money. And this woman, Denise McKenzie, one of our disclosure project witnesses, she's in the book, she's in our videos. She was a SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, office worker. She was hired to be in an office here, and here's what it was. She described it. There would be basically file cabinets, and they were mostly empty files, and they would get millions of dollars, millions upon millions in this office. They would gin up false reports back to Congress and the oversights, making it look like we're busy doing this. It went out the back door into these illegal projects, unsupervised and unacknowledged completely to the people who are supposed to get the reporting on where the money's going. She saw it personally and testified that this is the case, and she would swear to this under oath. Now, she's not the only one. This is outrageous. So that's how you can fund operations. That's not all of it, but we'd be here all day, but you get the gist, right? It's one criminal event after another. And then you have this, the psychological warfare targeting of the media and public, you guys, PSYOPs. Now, where did this start? Next slide. This gentleman, early CIA director, 50 to 53, and you'll see this document next. And this is the document. Now, I received this after meeting with the CIA director, Woolsey, got a big box of documents that came in, very interesting. It was released in '94, shortly after. I suggest that we discuss at an early board meeting the possible offensive or defensive utilization of these phenomena, referring to UFOs, for their psychological warfare purposes. You're going to hear this again in a moment. Now, what does that mean? They engaged, we have a document that shows they engaged Disney Studios to make cartoons and pieces of entertainment that would make this issue look ridiculous and make full fun of it. They made sure that the National Enquirer, the founder of whom was a CIA psychological warfare person, would carry it exclusively so that the New York Times and credible media wouldn't report on this, but it would be seen in tabloids like the National Enquirer, so it could be sort of defamed by association. All of that. And then you have this kind of problem. One of our Disclosure Project witness, Lieutenant Colonel Dwayne Arneson, stationed at Maelstrom, and he saw the internal message that there were multiple ICBMs that went offline during a UFO event there. And you'll see in the next one, this Captain Salas, who was actually in the silo where there were at least 10, and I've heard that it was actually 18 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, they had told me, I mentioned this yesterday, that they felt that the ETs were saying, for God's sakes, please don't blow up this beautiful planet. But if you do go to mutual assured destruction, which would destroy all life on Earth, we can intervene. So similar events happened in the Soviet Union. So they weren't attacking us. They were trying to warn humans not to be so reckless with things that could be an extinction level event. However, people in the UFO subculture and in the media hijacked these witnesses, turned it into History Channel Invasion Week about the national security threat of UFOs. Spin, spin, spin. One fact, two narratives. One's false, that builds up the threat from outer space, which fits the agenda of this criminal organization. The other one, the truth, which is completely understandable intellectually, but also from a point of view of social evolution. You know, these civilizations do not want us to terminate life on this planet because they consider this planet precious. And so this is the log of that event. And it just shows we have the documents to back these things up. Next. Next. And then we get to an event like this. Everybody knows this event. Japan Airlines flight, 1986. The captain encountered over Alaska. On the polar route from Paris to Tokyo. It was a 747 heavy cargo ship, not people. And this is him describing that this is the captain, Terushi, I think his name is said. I'm not good with Japanese names. This is his original sketch. Take a look. This massive walnut-shaped object, thousands of feet across, huge. And it was moving non-linearly. What does that mean? One sweep of the radar scope, it would be here. And then next it'd be here, many, many miles away. You know, just boom. Almost like a teleportation. Up here, 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 here. This was an extraterrestrial vehicle. Next. And this is the report officially to the FAA of this incident. Jets were scrambled. I think they were F-16s from Air Force Base, et cetera. And here is the wonderful drawing that Mr. Schratt's team has done. You see the 747, and by proportion, the size of this object. It's seamless, very large, and moving non-linearly, like a quantum entanglement, like this. Okay? So, next. Here's the Disclosure Project witness, John Callahan. And he was in charge of accidents and investigations for the FAA. He was at the original National Press Club event. His full testimony we have on our YouTube channel, and his testimony transcript is in the Disclosure book. I recommend you read it. Now, what he said was, and this is interesting, they called NORAD, the NCO called me in, NORAD knows about this, we don't want to know what this is. The people that know. We just watch and see what happens. That's our job. I insisted there has to be a report filed. He said, there is a report that you can file. It's about an inch thick and the first 2 pages about the sighting, blah, blah, blah. In other words, he was being sort of encouraged not to file this paperwork that's two inches thick. And next. And you know, this is this whole account of what he ran into, but he persisted. Next. So, well, we'll hold here. What happened to that radar footage? So if you look at his testimony, the head of the FAA, who had been an admiral, forget his name right now, called a meeting. It was ordered to have a meeting. And there were 3 people from the White House staff, 3 people from the CIA, and 3 people from the FBI. The CIA people took charge of the meeting. And they said, we want every bit of data you have on this event, and we're taking it. And he knew immediately they were going to cover this thing up, the proof of it, the radar tape. And he said, oh, no, you're not. But he complied with the request. What they didn't know, he kept the original radar tape and gave it to the Disclosure Project, and we have it in our archive. Yeah. Very heroic, patriotic man, John Callahan, to do that. And by the way, there's no risk of any legal issue here since the group that ordered the confiscation is a criminal enterprise. End of discussion. Bye-bye. Just wait. All right? Bye-bye. You know, these fascists have had enough run. It's time for us to say we've had enough of it. We have enough. So here you have, an event happened, Unacknowledged, which I presume most of you have seen, hits 750 million views. What happens next? Well, this is a redacted, it's a very extremely senior person associated with this matter. The CIA is supportive of what we're doing. He says, I'm glad to hear all is fine. I have watched the Rat Pack run scams against the U.S. government, loony billionaires, and now average citizens. Keep up the good work. What he was referring to was when TTSA and this disinformation expert out of the Department of Defense, Luis Elizondo, surfaced. And he was very concerned. He knew for a fact they were going to gaslight the public in the wrong direction, saying that we don't know what these things are, but they're a threat to the national security, all the false narrative. And it couldn't be one of ours, because the bigger secret isn't that you believe they're alien or extraterrestrial, it's that you think these could be ours. And if you conclude they're ours, then we're going, why are we still burning oil? If you understand that those are an electromagnetic field propulsion system, right? That's the biggest part of the secrecy. It's not the ET part, it's the human part. And this is where I get to this. So I always say you think you know what the Tic Tac is, and I've had this discussion with some number of people in the government. So let's go to and play this first. First of all, it's off the Nimitz. You know this, 2004. It's all been over CNN everywhere. So both of these are actually objects from the Lockheed Skunk Works we showed you yesterday, where they come in and out of. Some of them are small enough to load onto C-130s or on craft or be at other places and move. Here's a drawing of one from 1967 that is in our archive, and we'll go to the next slide and see. There it is. That's the Tic Tac boiler UFO, 1967. It's white, shaped like a Tic Tac. If you get up close to it, you'll see some of these electrical protuberances and probes on it. Next. And here's a drawing of one as it was seen by a whole group of witnesses there in Pennsylvania, 1967. And here's the one that was seen off the east coast of San Diego in 2004, the west coast of San Diego. So the prongs and propulsions exist in both cases. These are reported by the Pentagon. Now the people reporting and studying at the Pentagon didn't know that this was a human asset. The co-chairman at the time and now co-chair of Senate Intelligence saying, well, is this from China? It's coming out of our backyard here. That's what you need to understand. And here we have a new witness has come forward. He's frightened to speak publicly so far, but he was at the Azores Island in Portugal in 1991 at the Lajes field. And there was the Tic Tac being offloaded off a C-130. And this was in 1991, as you can see, 23 years before the event, or 13 years before the event that was off the Nimitz. Next. And here's a nice color drawing that they did. And it is that object. Now, the question becomes, who's zooming who here? So you have folks who have these assets who are acting like, what, who, us? This is why I said when the senior investigator for the intelligence community went out to Lockheed Skunk Works, the reason he ended up turning to us is because he knew he was being lied to when he went to the Skunk Works and was shown a bunch of old jet aircraft. He was going, well, wait a minute. So he began to question everything that he was being provided through channels, that the Senate Intelligence Committee was being provided, that the Pentagon normal chain of command was being provided. And he then reached the conclusion they needed some help, so we've offered it. Now, this gets into a little more scarier stuff, but it's time for childhood's end here in the disclosure community. The rogue criminal and psychological warfare operations that began in the late 1950s include abductions and mutilations. So now go to the next slide, and you'll see, listen to what this Air Force intelligence officer, who was a professional disinformation agent, said.
Had you heard of any the projects that deal with ET simulations? And what I'm referring to here, there have been some contact events. The one you're referring to, I have sources, was actually not ET, but was, if you will, a staged event by military or some special operations to look ET because this woman had seen something classified. Have you heard of those sort of operations?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if
false INW.
Yeah, right. We did do that. Yes, OSI did that. There was a special group out of the 7602nd Air Intel Wing at Fort Belvoir that came out and did that. They had these people that had maybe some sort of defects, anatomical defects that were brought in to fool people into thinking they're aliens. Yeah. I can't give you any specifics because the program is still classified, and they probably still doing it. I wouldn't doubt it. They were still doing it.
Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Now, why is this important? This is direct testimony from a military official admitting that they're staging these abductions. And we've known this. I've known this since 1993. I've tried to warn people of this. If you listen to Stephen Digna's testimony from yesterday, you will see that the technologies that existed in 2000, when he had that experience that would resemble being brought into a craft like an abduction, but then combine that with what the other witness that I showed that ended up being an attempted abduction where he knocked the creature down, and it was actually a man-made, what we call a programmed life form, PLF, that had the integrated circuits and all this inside under what looked like skin, but it was actually synthetic. Now you combine these capabilities together that have been growing in their stagecraft, the ability to deceive since the late 50s to now, and you can imagine what those capabilities consist of in 2023. And so this is why I tell people, be very careful about your conclusions and assessments based on the rubbishing of this subject in tabloids and on the internet and sensational shows. There would be no reason for interstellar civilizations to physically take people. If they wanted to reproduce you completely, they could take one of your cells and create you from that, or even your electromagnetic signature of your genetic material from that cell. So none of it makes any sense. The implants were also, if you look at Mr. Pollack's testimony, who did not come forward in 2001 because he was afraid for his family, he gave us a letter authorizing the release of his testimony upon his death. He died a few years ago. His wife or significant other, they weren't married, sent us the certificate, and we released that testimony. It's on our channel on YouTube, where he describes the creation of these RF and other chips that they were putting in people. They had developed it for animals. He had a meeting with CIA folks, and Siemens Corporation manufactured 2 billion with a B of them. Pollack. He's on the Pawelac. He's on the YouTube channel. So remember, there's a long history of this to unpack. And then we get to this, where I met with the Prince of Liechtenstein. where he flat out told me, this is in 1994, at the Four Seasons Pier Hotel in New York, there at Central Park, and he said to me, and I quote, "The reason I'm funding the abduction researchers in the United States is that we want the public to hate and be afraid of the aliens so that we can have an interplanetary war," quote unquote. Next. And then you have this. It was a sort of, the person who wrote it later said, well, it wasn't officially part of this strategic studies institute, but she submitted it. And it was her describing the creation of, and the next slide you'll see it, a global UFO cult, which will involve the abduction of citizens so as to foster an illusion that this Earth is facing an extraterrestrial threat. UFOs, a preference will have an expertise in computer technology, since that expertise will be required in the future. RMA scenarios, use of experimental drugs, true. Holographic projections, true. Directed energy technologies or weapons, true. Induced auditory input, experimental aircraft, meaning these UFOs that are man-made, and special effect costuming, which is what Doty was referring to, the Air Force gentleman, and stagecraft, among other things, will be used to persuade abductees of the reality of their circumstances. Got it yet? All right, next. I know this is upsetting everyone's belief system because we all love someone else to hate and be afraid of. That's what all the abduction and mutilation is about. Who we're going to fight next after we're done fighting every country in coalition, right? It's the next big enemy. This is what Werner von Braun said to Carol Rosin. You've seen that. And then we have this, an alien harvest. Really? Was it alien? Next. Let me just say before we get to this, the doctor, he was a hematologist pathologist, renowned in Denver, who was a dear friend of mine, passed away, John Altshuler, MD. He was the guy who was called in on the Snippy the horse case way back, I think it was late 60s, that mutilation, and on many others. And he studied them and concluded that it was not having to do with the ETs at all, that it was very deep cover, illegal black projects, using advanced technologies to do this, to make it look like aliens were in fact doing these animal mutilations. And so I began to research this and found out that there were folks who we hope will come forward who were on the tactical teams doing so. Some were using helicopters that were sound abated so you didn't hear them. Others were using these ARVs. Now fast forward to me being on a flight, and there was a man sitting behind me. This is where you wonder about how the universe orchestrates things. And I was sitting there, and he had a hat on. We were flying out of Denver to somewhere. And he owned 250,000 acres in northern New Mexico near the Four Corners. And he asked me what I was on the trip for, just chit chat, you know. And I told him who I was. He says, oh. He says, I know what those animal mutilations are. I said, well, really, what? He says, well, he's a very wealthy individual. Had great turquoise jewelry. Anyway, he said, I have had so many of my cattle mutilated with such precision, but he was wealthy enough to put out his own black ops team with night vision. And he caught them red-handed using these kind of aircraft, humans, mutilating and taking parts of his cattle, but specific areas. And he says, I don't know what they're doing with those specific areas. Oh, I do. I said, look, I know exactly what they're doing. I'm a doctor. They're taking the areas, they're excising the areas that have a high mitotic index, meaning the cells turn over like epithelium, sexual organs, rectum, all that. And the reason is that those are used in a substrate as sort of, if you're doing it like a petri dish, you have to have some kind of growth culture. A growth culture for some of their monstrous experiments they're doing in some of these deep underground military bases. And I've known this for a very long time. But so I just shared that with him so he would understand what they're doing. But he actually had the reconnaissance team to see it. Somewhere in my archive I have this gentleman's name. But he spent a fair amount of money doing this reconnaissance. And he wrote to the government and to the military and so you have got to stop doing this. I'm losing a lot of my cattle. And of course, the spokesperson for the normal constitutional government's going, huh, what, me? You know, because they don't know. They're not lying. They're not lying. No, 99.9% of the people in the US government have no knowledge of this. So if they say, we know nothing about this, they are being truthful. Now, there are some devils who do lie, but most of them are honestly answering to the best of their ability because they are not read in to the illegal black end of the projects. And then we have this gentleman, Dr. Jacques Vallée, who I've known for quite some time. And he puts in his 1992 entry in his journal, next, and he published this book. And you can see what this says. I've secured a document confirming that the CIA, he has this document, simulated UFO abductions in Latin America, Brazil, and Argentina as psychological warfare experiments. See that word again, psychological warfare? It's going to come up a lot, my friends. On Tuesday, aerospace researcher Morvan Salas met me in Burbank. I gave him the Flexment blah, 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 of the Costa Rica photographs going to dinner in Hollywood, who told us that the abduction miniseries they were working on had run into problems. John Mack insists the aliens are good guys who came to save us, while the plot takes a negative twist in Hopkins' sadomasochistic mindset. This is Bud Hopkins, the artist who became a hypnotherapist and what have you. And so we can move off of that. So how many data points do you guys need before you understand you've all been played? You've all just been played. So this is where I am an extreme skeptic. And this is what I know I'm very unpopular in saying this about most of what passes out there is the narrative in the UFO subculture. And here I want to just point out, so those of you, to make this crystal clear, and I think, Michael, you did some of this, correct, with the side-by-side? Mm-hmm. But let's go through this again so I can give you some granular detail. Next. So here you have something of similar shape. Now at a distance, and to the untrained person, including a jet pilot chasing one of these objects. On the left, we have an ET craft Gordon Cooper saw. Seamless, no parts, all of a part. And the other one that looks very similar with these electrostatic tendrils and objects on it that's man-made from 1976. We have an ET craft here in Melbourne. The next one is one that looks very similar with a little cupola and a little antenna on top. Not too dissimilar from what Mr. Herrera saw in 1968 in Canada. Next. You have this seamless, real disc-shaped object near Tulsa, and then the man-made, very similar knockoff that was early on in Twin Falls, Idaho, when they were trying to test a combination electrogravitic disc, which I hope we hear from. So yeah, I'll say next when we're ready to go next. Hello? Hello? Where do we go? Okay. So look what it has. It has this sort of like rocket thrusters, but it also had an electrogravitic component. So there's a hybrid. There are hybrid ones. And this was because they had not perfected the disc that you'll hear about from John Warner IV that was brought over from Germany in 1945 by multi-billionaire Paul Mellon and Alan Dulles and George Patton. So, and if you look at some of the early footage, home movie footage of these early UFOs that were man-made, they kind of flutter. You've seen some of those footages and they're going like, it's because they hadn't mastered the gravity control properly until 1954. So some of the early ones had hybrid systems, and some of the recent ones do as well. And the ones that were purely electrogravitic, electromagnetic field propulsion, they kind of wobbled and they couldn't control them quite well. It took some years to get that nailed down from the mid-40s until 1954, about a decade of R&D. Next. Oh, no, we're here already. So here you have an actual ET craft that was seen in England. If it was just at a distance, zipping along, here's the man-made one. Now, where was this? This is Norton Air Force Base, 1988. We have the transcript of the interview by Brad Sorensen, who, to an Aerospace reporter, described this in detail and said that the components in these man-made ones, look, there was a baby one, a mama one, a daddy one, different sizes, I think 20, 30 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet, something like that, if I remember correctly. And that was at this secret Norton Air Force Base air show in 1988. And it was on the other side of a curtain where there were some very advanced conventional aircraft and jets. And this was sort of a pitch to get more funding for these covert programs. And Brad Sorensen was in there. Mark McCandlish ended up doing the drawings. And then Mr. Schratt's team has taken this a step further to show these. Now keep in mind that the components inside these objects were from the Mercury era, late 50s, early 60s time period in terms of the components. It wasn't extraterrestrial. But I bet you 99.999% of the people at the Pentagon would think it's not ours. But that was in the late 50s. This was like an antique. Let's go back. I'll say next when I want to go back. Hello? Okay. So the reason this is important is that there were also scorch marks on it. And they had actually been told these had been through around the solar system, late 50s, early 60s. Ironically, my uncle worked on the lunar module using little jets and stuff and rockets in 1969, and he was Northrop Grumman. But his whole career was Northrop Grumman and then Northrop Grumman, but he was never read into this. So they did the best they could with what they knew, which were jets and rockets. Next. And here you have a very sophisticated device that I mentioned yesterday that was retrieved, crashed in 1993. And then you have a very similar quasi-boomerang shape over the Hudson Valley in 1998. So if you were just to observe casually at a distance these objects moving, it's like the old commercial for the Memorex tapes. Is it real or is it Memorex? And you have to keep that in mind. And this is a very important thing to think about when you're studying any UFO case. Next. And similarly, ET vehicle, very involved case that we are in the archives, 1951, with some pattern on them of lights. But then you had this man-made one in 1983 in Alabama, very odd-looking, very large object with people in it. There are many of these sort of objects seen. Next. And then again, you have the crash retrieval that was seen at Wright-Patterson. Presumably, this object is still there. They couldn't even get into it with a laser and drill bits and what have you. And here's something that you could say, if it was moving along from England in 1995, that is a man-made one. And this one is clearly man-made. If you look at the underside, you see pipes, you see details, there are electrical circuits. The ones, and what Stephen Digna described, there were also clearly electrical, where it even docked and plugged in. Now, an interstellar vehicle isn't going to do that. They're seamless, they're very advanced, they are manufactured from a type of technology where they are pulled out of the 0-point substrate of space-time. The energy is like a electromagnetic blueprint that then pulls it into 3D. This is why every component of it is integrated in a way where we couldn't manufacture it. And I know the people who worked on both. Very, very different. And why are these distinguishing characteristics important? Because if our investigators or in the public are going to be able to make a discernment between a false flag and fake alien events using the man-made ones versus an extraterrestrial one, this has to be understood, even though I know it gets to be granular and confusing. Next. And so it goes. Here we have one in Italy in 1961, seamless, very large, over a fishing vessel. Here's a man-made one, Dayton, Texas, 1980. Now that case you're looking at is a complex one. This is the Cash Landrum, correct? Now here's the problem with this story. You've all heard of the Cash Landrum case where these people were irradiated with radioactive material coming out of this object that was a UFO. Now, the covert government, the illegal secret government, was very happy for the people to think this was extraterrestrial, and it has many of the characteristics. But where is the nuance? If you look at the testimony, from Air Force Office of Special Investigations Officer Richard Doty. He was the PI, principal investigator on this event. He debriefed the 4 human pilots. They had an ET object. They couldn't quite perfect the energy system. Foolishly put a nuclear power device on it, because we had in the early days even attempts of a nuclear aircraft, as some of you may know. And this, however, malfunctioned. They had some sort of a filter or pump problem. It started leaking out radioactive material. It spewed it all over these innocent people. And they eventually escorted it over, and it landed in an Air Force base west of Houston, out in Texas. However, this was a human mishap, because it wasn't in the indigenous, let's say, extraterrestrial power plant. It was one that we put on because we couldn't quite figure out how to get it to work, and this was a test flight. And it badly malfunctioned. And of course, those people and their heirs, if they're still living, with this testimony can sue this group for these serious, life-threatening injuries. They were almost killed. It was very serious. They were hospitalized, radiation. They had to go up and dig this road up 2 or 3 times just to get rid of the trace of all the radioactivity. Totally covered up. Next. And then we turn to this. Media corruption. Well, tomorrow we'll be at the National Press Club and we'll see what gets covered. Hollywood films, directors and producers have been induced to make false narrative films on this subject. Good example, Fire in the Sky. Fire in the Sky was about the Travis Walton case. I know Travis Walton. They portrayed it as an alien abduction torture case on board this craft. Let me explain what actually happened. He ran underneath on a damp forest floor with a buddy, a vehicle, ET vehicle that was out there, and there was an electrostatic charge. These craft put out gigawatts of power. It's an unbelievable amount of energy. And so it's like a static electricity, but on a big scale. So he got hit with the equivalent of a bolt of lightning, knocked him back, and he went into fibrillation. As an emergency doctor, as soon as I heard this guy, I know exactly what happened to him. I'm taking care of many electrocution and lightning strike victims. And the ETs took him, put him in the equivalent of an interstellar ICU ward, stabilized him. When he came to, attacked the ETs. But they finally calmed him down. They let him sit in the control module and sort of navigate out. And then when he was stable to return home, they returned him near his home and left. They saved his life. Now, Fire in the Sky portrayed as vicious aliens abduct and torture this poor lumberjack. Poor shit. All right, sorry. I mean, this stuff, guys, got to stop it. It's just false. It's fraud. It's buying into the CIA narrative and to what Werner von Braun warned us all about. Bob Schwartz, who I met with at a salon in New York City back in the 90s, a very good friend of Mike Wallace, 60 Minutes. I was on the board of AOL Time Live back then. And he told me that Mike Wallace had gotten a cache of documents and information on this and wanted to do a major expose about the ET and the group holding the secret and all that. And at that time, Westinghouse, I believe, owned CBS, and they said, "You will not do this story." And he turned to me, he said, this was when Mike Wallace, you heard about him going to a deep depression, almost suicidal. He said on Larry King, my whole life's been a fraud. He didn't admit it was because of this. One of the most famous investigative reporters in history. But CBS would not let him do the story. And yet he knew it was real. And what Bob Schwartz said to me, he says, Dr. Greer, this is like in 1995 or something. The media are scribes, taking dictation from the right hand of the king, period. I went, oof, this is my learning days in the early 90s. Then we had Ira Rosen, ABC. He was 60 Minutes, became ABC News executive producer, Primetime Live, and all those. He came to my home. We gave him 35 hours of top secret military disclosure testimony that some of you have seen. All the documents we had. He looked at this. He says, this would be the biggest story in history. I'm going to hold a series of town hall meetings. And he got back. I said, Ira, I don't think they're going to let you do this. They wouldn't let Mike Wallace. He said, I'm executive producer of this now. I will be able to do it. No problem. No problem. Young and sort of, he was friends with Al Gore. I can make this happen. So he takes all this evidence. We give him all this evidence. He goes back to ABC New York. And he says, he calls me up a couple weeks later, he says, I'm not going to be able to do that show. I said, well, why is that, Ira? Who's telling you? He says, you know who they are. That's all he said. And we stay in touch occasionally, but I think he's back at 60 Minutes now. Now, you can get on 60 Minutes if you're given the false narrative. We don't know what they are. They're a threat to national security, implication the aliens are. That false narrative will get you on every news show in the world because they are controlled by the CIA. Next. Then we have this document, 1991, Bush era, George H.W. And interestingly, it brags about how they have people embedded in all the major news. Read this. And that, of course, the CIA is by law forbidden to be involved in domestic activities whatsoever. So there's a violation of the law in black and white. You cannot do this, but they can change and alter stories. Look at what this says. Postpone, hold, scrap stories that we don't want out. This in the United States of America, where we're supposed to have a free press and freedom. All right, next. And then don't take my word for this, please. I'm just a retired emergency doctor. Listen to what CIA Director Bill Colby, who tried to save the planet with us before they got him killed. But listen to what he said.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal? We do have people who submit pieces to American journals. Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks? This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
There you go. The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media. He was CIA director 73 to 76. So you sort of bridge the Nixon-Ford era. There's the same director of the CIA whom a member of my team was to meet with so he could hand off a solid-state zero-point energy device in 1995, although he was doing it rather clandestinely in your sort of handoff sort of way, which is very ill-advised, by the way, for those of you listening in the intelligence community, because it should be in the full broad daylight. You put a spotlight on it. I advised against it. He did it. He was also going to convey $50 million in funding so we could, the Disclosure Project, release this technology open source and get the world off oil. That week, they found him floating down the Potomac River, made it look like a canoeing accident. His best friend, a full bird colonel, told me point blank it was a wet works assassination. Now let's hear from Carol Rosin, Wernher von Braun's spokesperson.
And we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. There are many enemies, he said, against whom we're going to build this space-based weapon system. The first of whom was the Russians, which was existing at that time. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Now we call them rogue nations or nations of concern. Then there would be asteroids. And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat. Well, at the time, I kind of laughed when he said asteroids, and when he said extraterrestrials, I knew I wasn't going to deal with that subject. And now we hear on the news just today, this week, that they've slid in another enemy. Only this time we're going to protect our satellites. In other words, we have to have some reason to spend these trillions, to waste these dollars on a space-based weapon system, and they're all lies.
There you go. So actually, she was charged to get that message out from Wernher von Braun, who invented the rocket with Adolf Hitler's regime, but was brought in under Operation Paperclip and others to be part of our early aerospace program. But he very much regretted this, and he warned against this false alien threat, because by 1974, when that was shared with Carol Rosin, he knew that that ship had already sailed. They already had been involved in vicious psychological warfare and staging of events, including abductions and other things. And so he was very concerned that this was a juggernaut that was on a fast track that we couldn't pull back from. So that's why he asked her to devote her life to that mission. And God bless her. She couldn't be here because her husband is now 91 and needs a lot of help, but she's just a wonderful person. Now I want to get to this. I call these inverse witnesses. I mentioned it yesterday. And, this is a whole bunch of people who, by all rights, would be read in on this, and who I know for a fact were denied access. Bill Clinton denied access and actually ended up being waved off by George H.W. Bush. You're going to see a testimony in a moment about that. CIA Director Woolsey, who at the time had no access. I have the documents proving, notwithstanding the media saying that he denied that the dinner meeting was about that. It was the only subject of the dinner meeting. It was the cover story for it. And I mentioned yesterday, these guys, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. Senator Barry Goldwater, presidential candidate in 1964, those of you who know your history, and lost to Johnson, of course, but a very senior member of the key committees in the Senate, obviously, and a conservative Republican. He had no access and was denied access. Admiral Tom Wilson, the head of Intelligence Joint Staff, whom I personally briefed. The King Charles, then Prince Charles, whose family were trying to get information on this, but they got it through flying saucer review. And the briefing document I put together for the president, which we had couriered by a friend of his who I know. The Minister of Defense, Lord Hill Norton of Great Britain, with whom I spent several hours, and he explained it, even though he was the head of MOD in England and also MI5 and 6 by extension there in that country, he was never told anything about this. And even when he was head of the military committee for NATO, he didn't. It was only after he left those commands he found out this was true, and he was furious that he had been denied access. Next. Then you have Senator Dick Bryan, member of the Select Committee on Intelligence of the Senate. Met with him at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. I was put on one of those little carts, driven to what looked like a janitor's closet, went in, it was a VIP room. And he explained, and of course, guess what? Nellis in Area 51 is in his district, Nevada. But he was totally said, I've heard these things, I've never been read into it or briefed on it. He was kind of amazed that it could possibly be true, et cetera. Now that was back 20 years ago. Fast forward, same situation now. This is why we have to change this. General Patrick Hughes, 3-star Director of Defense Intelligence Agency, I mentioned him already. Representative Dan Burton, he was chairman of the very powerful Government Reform and Oversight Committee, came to the 1997 briefings for Congress that we set up that were private, had no access, and had been never told anything about this subject. Admiral Pierre Morin, PhD, French Minister of Defense, he also had said the same problem exists in France, and we have a thick file, what I call the French connection, of our involvement with the Ministry of Defense in the time of Sarkozy, President Sarkozy. The Honorable Paul Hellyer, Minister of Defense of Canada, who read Colonel Corso's book and then reached out to me. We did a press conference in Toronto, and he said the whole time that he was MOD head for Canada, this issue, even though he knew it had to exist, he never got access, was never told anything, even though there was a component of this illegal secret government operating in Canada and all other countries. Stephen Smith, the Minister of Defense for Australia, when I was there in 2013, whom I had met with and spoke about this at a meeting on Hayman Island. It was a gathering of 120 leaders from around the world. I was there as an unacknowledged guest and gave all the information that I felt they could take in a short weekend. But he says, yeah, I'm so fascinated because right there in the middle of Australia is Pine Gap, which is a key facility, mostly run by U.S. And so this is a very interesting, just happened in April. So I'm meeting with a man who wishes not to be named right now because he's still very active in Hollywood. He's one of the most senior producers in Hollywood, and he was part of this Millennium Project. He was at dinner with a rock star who I know, and former President Bill Clinton. At some point in the evening, Clinton was asked what the story with UFOs was, and bear in mind that this was this was not a hot mainstream topic at the time. In fact, it fell under the category of frivolous conspiracy theory to much of us, the mainstream. Former President Clinton's reply was shocking and more than eye-opening, if not revealing in much detail. He used the phrase mind-blowing without saying why. He also added that as president, he was briefed on the subject to a certain but very general extent and was deterred and dissuaded from using his position to dig further in the subject. This included a conversation with former CIA director and president. I thought it was George H.W. Bush. Should he not be named? He put this in there. Because everyone's scared. This guy's scared. So that's why I'm not naming him. Who also deterred him from conducting his own investigation. Clinton brought in an outside investigator to pursue the details. I believe this person was Dr. Stephen Greer. So anyway, what a journey. But what I'm saying here is very worrisome, is that you have people who obviously, if you're the President of the United States, you cannot have someone who's now out of office, who's been part of this committee, like George H.W. Bush, come in, and it was stronger than what he's portraying. He was, I know because from other sources, he was threatened. And then there were inducements for him to stay quiet. And I'm sure you know the rest of the story. This is Senator Bryan next, who I met with. Okay. And this is General Hughes, just to give you an idea of these gentlemen next. This is Dan Burton, very, very interested. Admiral Pierre Moran's letter to me from the Ministry of Defense. I just wanted to establish we have the files on some of these things next. Paul Hellyer, you all know him, next. Stephen Smith, Minister of Defense, Australia, at that time, 2013. And of course, you all know this leaked document from Eric Davis about my briefing Admiral Wilson. And of course, everyone thought that couldn't be. I warned the public. The head of intelligence joint staff has been denied access to these projects and threatened. And of course, when he first contacted one of these compartments, and we'd given him one of the document that we have in our archive, that's a National Reconnaissance Office document marked, secret, that listed the project code names and code numbers on it. So that was provided to him. It was from the 1990s, and it was given to him in 97. And but unfortunately, he was denied access when he pushed. He was threatened personally and with a demotion, meaning a star off your lapel. And this is the letter to Kathleen Hicks and Stacy Dixon, Department of Defense, this year. And this is one I want to give accolades next. Look at the signature, 16 members of the Senate saying, pick up the pace, we want more investigation, and we want this dealt with expeditiously. I'm not going to read this whole letter to you. Obviously, you can read it. Next. And then you have a stronger letter to Aero, the current office investigating this, from Senators Marco Rubio and Mark Warner. Why? Because I know the folks who've been in there who have shared aspects of this about the extraterrestrial component. And in one instance, the director of Aero, Dr. Shawn Patrick, got up furious, stormed out of the room because he didn't want to hear it. So you cannot be a scientist and an independent investigator if your mind is already made up before you do the investigation. So are they going to do this correct or not? So this information got back to the Senate Intelligence Committee, which it should. And they wrote this rather strong letter, which I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. This is the CIA director whom I briefed. We have the documents proving the whole purpose of the meeting was to brief and discuss this issue, although he has since denied it and defamed me, and he actually lawyers should be sued. Next. This is the letter from the head of the Arlington Institute, goes into granular detail about setting up this meeting with the CIA director and the purpose, and that my phones are tapped and everything we're doing is being watched. And quote, the most powerful interests in the world will do everything to stop this process. The letter is quite compelling. Next. I think that's the rest of the letter. Next. And this is a letter to me. Barry Goldwater is quite, I mentioned him. I did not brief him when he was a senator. It's way before my time. John McCain took his seat, for those of you who don't know that history. But John McCain, of course, is celebrated prisoner of war in Vietnam. But Barry Goldwater was World War II, he was quite a character. He was in his 80s when I was at his home in Scottsdale and that area, and his wife and he hosted me, and I had an assistant with me. And we started talking about this. And he said to me, I've been interested in this, and we have a huge file, Barry Goldwater, interest in this. But he told me this story and this was early on, I don't know, 90s, and I'm just, discovering all this stuff as a young doctor. So in between emergency shifts and 4 children raising, I'd fly all over the world meeting with folks like this. And what he said was, Curtis LeMay, General LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, was a dear friend of his. And Barry Goldwater was a general in the Air Force Reserves. And so he asked General LeMay if he could get into the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base where extraterrestrial material had been sent in the early days, and which are still there. If they haven't moved them, I doubt it. It's a huge complex. And Curtis LeMay turned to him and said, excuse my language, God damn it, Barry, I can't even get into that area anymore. And if you ever bring this up to me again, I will personally see that you are court-martialed out of the Air Force Reserves. And they're friends, close friends. And I said, Barry, was he joking? He said, no, he was serious as a heart attack. So then I asked him, he says, who is running this? So I start naming the people I name who are on this senior committee. He didn't know that person and this person and that person. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some are deceased now. But finally, I named an admiral, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. And he goes, oh, Bobby Ray, we've been friends for years. I said, well, he's only like in the top uppermost tier of that organization. He says, well, let me give him a call for you. I said, great. So he did. What follows next? Oof. So he makes this call, the Admiral Bobby Raymond. I don't know what was said, but it's put the fear of God in Senator Goldwater. His daughter, who used to run Goldwater Foods of Arizona, calls me and says, Daddy can't make another call like that for you. He hopes you can get this done, but it's too dangerous. He can't make another call like that. That was the end of it, which is all I needed to know. That's all I needed to know. That's all you need to know if you have 2 brain cells firing, right? Put this together. I mean, obviously, it was an absolute threat. And you remember, these are thugs. This one is, a letter back from the Secretary for the Prince Charles when we provide the presidential briefing materials we put together for the president. And next. And this is a letter from Lawrence Rockefeller, who was helping us get some of this material to some key people, including the Clintons back in the early days here in '94. The next. And so it goes. This is the Lord Hill Norton letter to me, about the meeting. Next. These are only in here, Admiral Wilson, the letter that set up the meeting. Next. Next. All right. Why did I want to go through all that? Because people are saying that none of these things have happened, and they have. And these inverse witnesses, now this isn't all of them. What I call an inverse witness is someone who damn well should have been read in, denied access, right? And if you're in a legal system, you cannot deny access to a president or a cabinet member. I should have added to this list Secretary of Defense Cohen, who before he did get read in, was denied access to the Gordon Cooper footage of that landed craft out in Edwards Air Force Base from 1956, I believe, 6, 7, in that period. So when you have that happening, you have to ask yourself, how can this be? In the United States of America or in the United Kingdom and elsewhere? It's because the organization, the illegal secret government, shadow government that Senator Inouye acknowledged this existed and has been existing, still is running these projects. Whether you're talking back in the era of Eisenhower or the current Senate Intelligence Committee, the President, National Security Council people, the only ones read in are the ones who are the devils embedded in the system to continue the secrecy. And that's a big problem in a democratic republic. It is the gravest threat to the rule of law in the history of the United States, bar none. So, what I want to say, thank you. One of my big concerns about all of this is the power of these corrupting interests to affect the media. And you're going to see, as time goes on, how much the media can really characterize this and cover it honestly. We'll see. And the reason I'm rather skeptical, aside from some recent articles, is the fact that we know for a fact that the intelligence community working on this issue really does corrupt the media. But then this opens up a can of worms. For whom? It opens a can of worms for the media corporations. Because if we can prove that they have in fact been in collusion with an illegal and unconstitutional operation, conspiracy charges and criminal code does not shield them from being culpable. And particularly because they have certain rights and privileges. Listen, in the fairness doctrine and other laws and the protection of journalists and sources, and there are laws that protect the fourth estate, the press. But if they abuse their freedoms and they collude with an illegal secret government operation to stamp out the truth, to ridicule people getting to the truth, to be biased, etc., they should be liable in a civilian RICO action lawsuit. And so I will tell you something I don't know if I've ever shared publicly. I think the chief reason that the cover-up and this secrecy has been able to be maintained is the collusion and the cooperation of the press and the media. Because any journalist worth a grain of salt could take the first disclosure, 70 top secret witnesses who handled bodies, who were in facilities, and Mr. Sheehan was there talking about the Carter years, could take that, do an investigation, blow the lid off this thing. It'd be the biggest news story ever, and there'd be Pulitzers for all involved. Why didn't they? Now, most journalists are wonderful people, but when you get into the editorial upper ends, this is where they have embedded people who are dual agents. They're on the payroll of the intelligence community and this group that's corporate, and they're in charge of what appears on screen and what you see in print. And at that level, not the level of the reporters, you guys that are here, I think completely, it'd be rare that you would be involved. Just like Mike Wallace was a victim. But the folks up there that kill the stories, change the stories, alter the stories, that's where the liability is. And it's a major liability because it makes a mockery of our democracy and of the freedom of the press. How can there be freedom of the press when the most important story in human history and the most important technologies that would literally save the biosphere and end poverty in a generation are subject to ridicule, suppression, etc.? You can't have it both ways. So at a certain point, we the people have to stand up to the media and say, no, We're not taking this anymore either. And we need to demand honest and fair and unbiased reporting on all of this. I'm really honored and pleased to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Donald Heckert. He's a very decorated Air Force pilot, U-2 pilot, had encounters with these objects back some years ago in the U-2, and has an extensive history with the Air Force and with special access projects. He is really a courageous man. I've met with him 3 different times, and I consider him now a friend and a brother in this effort. And I think he is a genuine hero of the United States of America. Well, let's welcome Lieutenant Colonel Heckert.
Forgive me if I try to speak quickly. The other thing is that military people have a language of their own. And so if you don't understand something, wave your hand out there and I will give you the long version of that acronym. My name is Donald W. Heckert. I was born at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1945. My father was a fighter pilot in Guadalcanal, and then later worked in New Mexico on the paperclip program, and then after that in Boston University, developing a camera called Baker Nunn camera. I'm a commercial pilot with over 7,000 hours. I have over 100 combat missions in Vietnam and also in the Middle East. Please. I was fortunate enough, because of my funny body shape, to have the one-time height and weight ratio that the Air Force issued for commissioning, and they also waived that for pilot training. I've flown the U-2R TR-1, that black long-winged airplane that Gary Powers was shot down in, for 11 years operationally. I have spent part of my career, because of my education in nuclear physics and weather, running the largest nuclear monitoring program that the U.S. possesses. And that's an array that monitors things under the water, things underground, and in the atmosphere, and it also involves satellites. So what I'm trying to do is let you know that I have a little bit of experience in what I'm going to tell you. The other thing, significant event, and this relates to why I'm so concerned about nuclear testing, was that I was the first U.S. airplane into the debris cloud of the largest atmospheric that China ever shot. And I received a lifetime burden of radiation. I also was involved with the reentry of a Soviet satellite named Cosmos 954, and that polluted a whole bunch of territory in Canada and the Slave Lake. You can all look at that. Later in my career, I commanded the largest detection network that the U.S. possesses in Alaska. It also has nuclear power generation for one of my sites. And we sample the background and have sampled the background of nuclear radiation weekly since 1945. And so there's a database of what's going on. After that nuclear monitoring assignment, I was assigned as a project officer to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where it was my job to manage the U-2, TR-1, SR-71, and other classified programs for the National Command Authority. Part of those duties included the requirement to go to the HAC, which is the House Select Intelligence Committee, and the Senate Select Intelligence Committee to justify black budgets. Additionally, and I'll get into this a little bit later, I had interplay and interactions with Kelly Johnson, the head of the Skunk Works, and extensive work with Ben Rich, who, as you all probably know, was a key factor in later years after Kelly Johnson retired. These are the two aircraft that I flew. The RF-4C was involved with the first the first UFO experience. And the one above is a U-2R, which was involved in the second experience. Next slide, please. I want to tell you a little bit about the classification system and why this kind of messes up everything and why the good doctor has tried to tell you about the problems with it. You can read for yourself that the first three areas for official use only, confidential, secret, they all have the definitions there. As a U-2 pilot, even if I had a TS clearance, they would not allow me to look at any materials greater than secret because of the danger of me being shot down, captured, and interrogated. So what happened to me in my career was totally accidental for a normal pilot. And that is, I ended up with, I believe, 9 different billets or accesses in 2 code word projects. The classification system, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that once you get into the SCI and compartmental system, there are other levels beyond that, and those are called the code words and special access. And you see things like the CNWITI, which is critical nuclear design information. And so you have to have that clearance to understand and work with those kind of issues. The Senior Crown, for instance, is the SR-71 program. A lot of people have heard the term Oxcart, and that was a predecessor to that. The Gamma is a CIA clearance for personnel and the recruitment of personnel. And then NPIC is the National Pictorial Interpretation Center. It exists in downtown DC, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you where it is right now, but they're responsible for all the imagery that is taken. And then the last one, Talankilo, and that is important because it's a satellite program. Now, most people do not, that are pilots, ever get the chance to go into the other facilities like NSA and CIA. And just by accident again, and my educational background, I was allowed to get jobs that required me to work with those agencies. And that's why I'm, I guess, standing here right now, because I have information that you really need to know. Let me go to the next slide, if you would, please, after that one. I want to tell you about my UFO experiences. The first one, there on the right, and it's on the left on the other screen, but that's an RF-4C. It is a Mach 2 place aircraft, or Mach 2 plus aircraft. And this is the UFO sighting occurred at night on the border between Thailand and Laos. I'd taken off my 2 armed escorts. The RF is unarmed. We're supposed to rejoin with me. They got delayed on takeoff, and I'm in a circular holding pattern. And I'm doing it 350 knots. I'm at 14,500 feet. When you go into combat, there are things called ground intercept radars, and then the term is GCI. And I've got 3 of these sites. tracking me, making sure that I'm safe, even when I go across the border. What happens next is that one of these GCI sites says you have a fast mover coming directly toward you out of northern Laos, possibly from North Vietnam. That gets your attention when you're unarmed and you're in a holding pattern. Well, the next thing that happens, the two other sites come up, confirm that that fast mover is heading my direction, but don't worry about it. It's above 70,000 feet. And so I'm pondering that when the object doesn't appear on my radar or my warning systems, I'm saying, well, it's not a big issue. All of a sudden, I see an intense blue-white light at 12 o'clock high coming in right at 1 o'clock. At that point, all of my systems in the airplane start alerting me that there's a problem. The airborne early AWACS program called DISCO, or the Lockheed product, Constellation, that is a radar airborne protection airplane, it alerts me that I've got a problem. Almost instantaneously, from 20 miles, that target is now 5 miles away, and it's still way up there. It's intense in that I'll tell you more about that blue light. But then 2 seconds later, Brigham, the GCI site, tells me it's at 14,500 feet. And aerodynamically and humanly, you just can't live through that. We're in a holding pattern that goes around and around. I'm on this leg approaching the turn. The UFO has switched, coming in right this way. And I'm asked by the GCI site, do you have the capability of photographing this? Well, it's at night, and that's not possible. But uniquely, this particular airplane has an advanced IR system, which the sensors on the bottom of the aircraft. At that point, I complete the turn. Now we're facing, and the UFO is pacing, staying exactly 5 nautical miles away, matching my 350 knots. At that point, because they told me to intercept, I go to afterburners, quickly accelerate through Mach 1, and start to close on that UFO. When I get within 3 miles, they say, hey, the UFO just matched. Now it's doing the Mach 1.2 that when you're doing it. At that point, I decided the only way I'm going to get imagery is to do what's called a LADS maneuver. And as you pitch up, straight up, and that way I can point the belly of my aircraft at that UFO, which I did. In the back seat is another, not a pilot, but we call him a weapon system operator and navigator. And that AD5 has a display, and he says, we got him. 2 seconds later, UFO, I watch it disappear. They said it disappeared off the radar at 80,000 feet. So now we have documentation, we have 3 radar sites, we have an AWACS there, and we've got a UFO. I go back, land at my base, which is Udorn, Thailand, go in for the debrief, and this is tactical reconnaissance, which means we normally develop that film within 30 minutes. We wait a little bit. All of a sudden, people come in that I don't recognize. They were in green rather than black this time. And they take my recorder and the tape that was with the mission, and they look at us and say, we want the maps. And I give them the maps, and then they say, we're done here, forget what you saw. Okay. It is now fairly late, almost 1 o'clock in the morning, and being interested in never following instructions, I call the first GCI site on what's called the Audubon telephone system and say, hello, I'd like to speak to the duty controller. He comes on the line and I identify myself. I'm the pilot, the RF with the UFO thing. And he says, oh, we're really excited about it. Everything. And then I hear him, yes, sir. He says, I gotta go, goodbye. Click. I tried 2 more phone calls, one to each other of the other sites. Nobody's gonna talk to me. And so it goes away. That is the end of that encounter as far as I'm concerned for about the next 11 years. Later, after my tour in Southeast Asia in the RF, I'm selected to go to the U2 program. And I now have basically about 500 to 600 hours in the U2. I'm currently flying, and that's that second encounter. The U2 flies between 9 to 11 hours. You're solo in a spacesuit, and I'm not going to go into the human needs right now. But the mission I'm flying, I take off in the mid-afternoon, waiting for the clouds to cover. I'm on an optical mission or photo mission, and my cameras are telescopic, and I can look 100 miles and give you probably about 6-inch resolution at 100 miles. The airplane has still got pods on it. That one on the right side is a SIGINT, or signals intelligence, where it can listen to the telephones and everything. And if that airplane, one like it, with the same equipment that was on it in 1976, all your cell phones could be monitored. My speech could be monitored, and even if you turned everything off, as long as there was electrical power in here, we could still monitor what was going on. There are very few of those assets, but there's a danger here. There are laws that require the monitors of those kind of systems not to track Americans. What happens next is that I get my photo mission complete. I've now got another 7 or so hours to fly, and it's obviously getting dark. Well, I probably didn't emphasize enough this blue light, my nuclear background. The frequency of light I saw in that first encounter, I'd seen only one other place, and that was in a nuclear pile that was functional in a nuclear reaction underneath a rather large column of water in a nuclear facility. It is very unique. If any of you have seen the xenon headlights that come down and they're super bright, that's what happened, okay? There's a sunshade because you're up above 98% of the atmosphere in the U2. If the sun's out, it'll burn you. And so we have a sunshade up there that's you can push out of the way. It's really important at night so you can look at the stars and have something to do when you're doing these orbits all the time. Well, that same intense blue-white light blinds me from above for about 4 to 8 seconds. It illuminates my black airplane and turns it completely from black to white blue. You think that gets my attention? Yeah, it scared me, I'll be honest, to death. I can show you video if you come over to my room of surface-to-air missiles coming within 100 yards of me. I can show you AAA that puts holes in the airplane. And I never deviated in my reconnaissance mission ever. This terrified me. The U-2 turns in 6 nautical miles at that altitude. and that's a defensive maneuver. The SR-71, same altitude, takes over 160 miles to do a U-turn. And so nothing in the world, to my knowledge, except another U-2, could make and keep a light on me. I abort that mission. That would normally be a really big deal. I land and nobody wants to talk to me. All I do is make out the forms and go away. Okay, those are the two encounters. Let me next explain that my follow-on assignment, because I'd had enough of the dangers and I now have 2 children. My wife kind of is really interested in me staying around a little longer. I accepted an assignment to Alaska, where the world's largest nuclear detection capability resides. I have a forward lab. We fly a weekly background to make sure, and this is in the northern latitudes. We have a seismic detection capability, and we have a underwater capability for detection and satellite detection. My first month there, we have what is called the Vela incident. You can look that up on the internet if you want. It's capital V-E-L-A. But what that is we detected in Alaska a under the water shot that took place off of Africa. The Carter administration denies that happened. My boss gets fired over the issue, and he's at headquarters AFTAC. And guess what? 2 years later, I have Chief of Staff Mathis, the chief scientist for the White House, and the Secretary of the Interior come to my SCI facility. And this is so compartmentalized, and this is what I was trying to explain with the definition of intelligence, that base wing commander, the 06, and the wing commander at Eielson Air Force Base could not come into my facility. I had absolutely very strict limited access. Anyway, those 3 people, after the briefing that we gave them, and I've got the documentation I can furnish if required, but they believed that that event took place. I find out years later that the results of that briefing and the other research they did caused South Africa to give up 5 nuclear warheads. Their other developer that was a joint shot of Israel has never acknowledged that they participated in that activity. From there, I was selected to go to Europe with a new airplane called a TR-1. And I need to explain again how this expands my accesses. There were 4 people, the wing commander, the director of operations, the intelligence officer, and I was the chief of ops and training for that new airplane. We went there ahead of the arrival of the new airplanes by about 90 days. You do what's called a bed down. And what that means is you're going to prepare all of the agencies, the hangars, this sort of thing, and any construction for this new airplane. And it's going to take a year to get to the point that you're combat ready. Because the intel officer got sick and the backup intel officer had gallstones, only one person had a clearance, and that was me. And so I'm forced now to do 2 jobs, the training job and the intel job temporarily. And that requires me to go to headquarters, use SAFE, and learn about all of the other operations in the European and electric and the African theater about what's called the peacetime reconnaissance program. That's knowledge that You can't believe how interesting that was to me. Anyway, I performed, that's supposed to be a 4-year assignment. And at the 14-month point, I am called by the head of Strategic Reconnaissance Center and says, if you want to fly actively again and operationally, you have to say yes. And I said, where's the job? And he says, I can't tell you. But I said, well, yes, throw me in that briar patch. The airplanes aren't here yet. And so 14 months into that 4-year tour, I go with another agency, and that location is classified. I can tell you it's in the Middle East. I do a job as the commander there, and we had an incident that involved the hijacking of a TWA 727 that got a lot of national news. Delta Force worked with us, and therein came a number of operational conflicts, which unfortunately I can't tell you what they were, but they caused the Secretary of the Air Force to ask if he could come to our site, and the other 2 agencies denied that access. Because of that access and those problems, I had an assignment canceled as a chief test pilot at Edwards for Black Program U2 and TR1. I get held up on this remote area for almost 2 weeks. My family is asking me, where are you? What are you doing? And who have you made mad? And at that point, I am told I'm going to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to become the special project officer for the U2, TR1, SR-71, and other agencies' developmental projects. As such, I have to justify the budget again to the Congress. That assignment goes well until I am asked to audit things that are going on in Area 51. When I arrive at Area 51, my whole purpose is to look and see why the money I'm spending isn't producing results in the programs I'm responsible for. There are 3 significant events. The first one involves a security violation, and this again is why I'm speaking to you about it, about something that I can't identify because I don't know what it is, but I'm in the chow hall and listen to 2 Navy people discuss pictures they've taken at night, unauthorized, of classified activities. And because my activity that I've been checking on and a number of other activities there, I report that as a security violation. Those people are immediately arrested, and their motive was totally to make money selling pictures of what they gathered on their low-light TV and IR systems. The next one is that I can't track where a lot of my money is going without results, and I find that other programs are utilizing my time and not paying, not acknowledging it and not allowing my programs to advance, and that puts them in jeopardy. The only way around that is to do what is called an Air Force suggestion. And that's normally an unclassified thing. I think I had the first code word, Air Force suggestion. And one of the benefits of that for the people that put that kind of thing in is that they get a portion of the money. And if I remember right, I think it's around 1% to 2%. Well, when you save millions of dollars and then it is accepted, there's a problem, and it's called a PR problem. And my boss calls me in, tells me, congratulations, we saved all this money, but we're changing your job description to include the programs that you wrote about. And so now we're not going to give you anything. You kind of go away. Well, at that point, I've decided I've had enough. my risks are to the point, and my family's growing up, and I have 4 children at this point in time, that it's time to leave the Air Force. A week before I retire, the IRS calls me down to downtown Dayton, Ohio, and I'm informed I'm being audited. Okay, you see some of the tactics that people use. That's concerning, isn't it? Well, they allow me to retire to Alaska. I am now in the gold mining business, and in order to keep the claims that we have, each year you have to do improvement filing. I go into the federal building, 2nd floor in Fairbanks, Alaska, flying in, that 60, 70 miles from the remote area, and hand in my paperwork to the recorder and clerk there. And she looks at me and says, okay, I need ID. And so I give her my Alaska driver's license. She goes away for about 5 minutes and comes back. We need a second form of ID, sir. And I give her my retired military ID card. She goes around the GSA petition, and I hear he's the one on the wanted poster. Well, my agency training pays off. I'm obviously not there, but I call the number I'm supposed to and say, we got a problem. The problem is that they do what's called sheet dipping in your orders. And they had me listed as the entire time I was overseas on that assignment as being in Philadelphia Air Station. And that's, I believe, even a fictitious address. Took them 2 years, an administrative law hearing with a judge. They flew in from San Francisco, but I did get $67.50 back. I hope that the endeavors that you're all here for are successful. It is my firm belief that the good Lord took care of me in 3 near-life-death experiences. I have to admit I had one crash, and that was north of the Arctic Circle in a research airplane in an ice-choked river, and we survived for 4 days. Now, the interesting part of that was my hunting buddy was the senior NCO in what's called the Cool School. That's Winter Survival at Arctic at Eielson. Really a great guy. His name is Joe Witch. When we fly back and land, they make you debrief, and they separate you and say, okay, tell us what happened. This is both the FAA and the survival people are really interested. We tell them, and we get back together, and they say, Colonel Heckard, you need to tell us about this discrepancy. You said you had about 30 days of food. We smoked meat in that 4-day period from a caribou we got. We got some ducks that were frozen in the freshwater lake. And we prepared to walk out on the river. And when it froze up, it obviously wasn't fully frozen yet. And I said, yes, that's correct, about 30, 35 days. And they looked over and says, Chief Witch, you said 75 days. What is the issue here? And he looks over to me and says, Colonel Heckard's a rather large guy. Anyway, God bless you for listening.
Some of what is left unsaid there is these guys who were filming things out at Nellis were Area 51 were not jet aircraft. Enough to be said there. There's a lot more information that the Colonel has, but I think, that's for a hearing at some point. One thing I'd like to invite to have at this time is we have a really renowned, wonderful man that I've known for a few years now, James Goodall. If you would come up and just briefly share your account of your conversation with Ben Rich prior to his passing. He's a wonderful aerospace historian, and thank you for being here and sharing.
My name is Jim Goodall. For those who don't know, I'm a retired Air Force Master Sergeant. My last 16 years, I was a historian. But my passion has always been Lockheed Skunk Works airplanes, from the P-80 to Have Blue to U-2 to the Blackbirds. And over the course of my many years digging and probing and being a pain in the butt to a lot of people, I became friends with Ben Rich. Ben Rich was Kelly Johnson's replacement. And for some reason, I got on his call list, and we talked quarterly for a little over 20 years. If I didn't call him, he called me. And in December of '94, Ben was near the end of his life. He was suffering from esophageal cancer from breathing the chemicals used in low observable materials. And that's one of my areas of interest as well. And we were talking about an old friend of ours, John Andrews, and you've seen some of the letters he's written that Michael Schratt had published, or had put up earlier yesterday and today. And after about 45 minutes, we're coming near the end of our conversation, and Ben said, Jim, we have things out in the desert, and he wasn't referring to Area 51, but said, we have things out in the desert that's 50 years beyond what you can comprehend. Now, I can comprehend a hell of a lot. And when he says, you know, it's more than I can comprehend, and he said, if you've seen movies like Star Trek or Star Wars, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort. The one I want to know, what wasn't worth the effort? And I said, Ben, you want to expand upon that? And like Ben Rich would normally do, he said no. And then he had the nerve to die on me about 10 days later. So just by that statement from the man who knew every secret that the colonel was talking about that he couldn't talk about, Ben knew. And he's the one who said, 50 years beyond what you can comprehend. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Beautiful. I'd like to just make a point here is that I said this yesterday, there's a million pieces of this that have to be put together. And Dr. Zahari has a piece, all these witnesses have a piece, and all the 752 whistleblowers and witnesses we've debriefed have pieces. But another, I think, very important piece goes back to the end of World War II. And I'm very pleased that he has agreed to share this story briefly. We're running out of time a little bit, but it's an important story because we have Senator John Warner's son here, John Warner IV. He's been kind enough to host Eric Hecker and Holly and at his place here in DC. And he has a very important story to tell you about what his grandfather shared prior to his passing. And his grandfather was the Paul Mellon of the Mellon family. So if you would come up and just share that, it would be very much appreciated.
And they would advertise with Carl Jung in Switzerland. And then we'd go out to his Eros conferences and talk with him and George Gurdjieff and all the mystics of the day out in Switzerland. So fast forward to 1942 late, his fox hunting buddies are General Marshall, General George Patton, and Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS. And Wild Bill said, look, we need all the mystics and people we can to take on the Nazi SS. They're way into the occult. Few people understand this in the context of military. You need to help us. And so when I was in college, I was going to go in the Navy, and I became a racing driver instead. But when I talked to him one time after 3 of his lethal martinis, he was pretty lubricated. I said, tell me about the war. What were you doing with Patton? Because Patton was a real interest of mine. And uncharacteristically, his wife had left the room. He never talked with her in the room. But he said, well, we were in Czechoslovakia in May of 1945. And he was with Patton, a couple of his generals. He was with Alan Dulles, who was station chief in Switzerland for the OSS. And my grandfather was friends with him. My grandfather's brother-in-law, David K.E. Bruce, was station chief in London. And so I guess he was read in on the German Wunderwaffe program. Now you're talking V-2 rockets, bigger rockets than that, radio-guided missiles, transistors. We did not invent them, the Germans did. Free energy projects like the Bell, which is a plasma accelerator, torsion field, Walter Gerlach's research. And so the story that he told me was that he was with Patton and Dulles and a few of these generals. And I want to say General Marshall, but I can't place him there in May 45, so I'm not sure. But he said they went into a big hangar outside of Pilsen, where the Germans had the Skoda Works. But inside the Skoda Works, we know now that General Hans Kammler of the SS, who was a contractor, he was in charge of the SSE-4 division. That's like the Area 51 of Germany at the time. Although his underground tunnels stretched all over Europe, there was the Riesa complex in Silesia, Poland, Berg Kristall, others. But this was near Pilsen, and he said it was an underground facility. And they saw the rockets. They saw the newer jet aircraft on drafting tables in a huge room. And they went into a large hangar that he said was at least 500 meters by 500 meters by 40 feet high. And there were rockets strewn everywhere. There were the radio-guided missiles, you name it. They had everything going on there. Some of it was destroyed. Some of the scientists had left, but there was a few Germans still there. Some of the science, they were all in the SS. And he said he saw a giant disc-shaped aircraft. And I said, is that the Flügelrad, the one with the BMW or Arado jet engines in the circle and didn't work? They had a lot of crazy projects going on. And he said, no, this one was much bigger. And my memory is thin, but I'm gonna say at least 100 meters wide and multi-story. Now this jibes, I didn't think anything of it at the time. This is 1985. I showed the Majestic 12 file documents to my dad in 1993. I was 31. He eventually caved in on those. And then after 9/11, I read Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which I recommend to everyone in this room. Also Igor Witowski's book, The Wunderwaffe. And my jaw hit the floor when they were talking about Hans Kammler and all this stuff out in Pilsen at the SSE-4 division. And I said, holy shit, that's my grandfather's story. No one's going to believe me. So fast forward in 2010, I hear this guy on a podcast, and he said, well, I went up to Senator Warner's door, the press secretary gave me this cold shoulder, and I was like, wait a minute, Stephen Greer, my dad had called me in 2001 and said, these UFO guys are here, maybe you ought to come down and see it. And I said, no, I've got a race. I couldn't make it in 2001. But I remember that story. And so I called him up and I said, I got some wild things to tell you. But I wanted to say another thing. My cousin, Chris Mellon, they just didn't pick this guy out of a hat. The Mellon family is a small committee of 300 ruling financial families of this country. Now, you can research that on your own. As far as what these bloodlines mean, they mean something to someone. And why there's been dozens of Mellons in military intelligence and civilian intelligence going back to World War II. I don't have all their names. I know Richard Mellon Scaife, he was involved. But these people, my grandfather, they helped fund the CIA and the NSA in the early days. Congress was strapped for cash. You got the World War II and you got the Korean War. So they started it as an off-the-books thing. Where did they learn that? General Galen and the SS. The SS was a financially independent fiefdom, an empire, which actually Hans Kammler came up with the idea of renting slave labor to the German corporations, Krupp, Mercedes-Benz, Messerschmitt, you name it. And they would pay the SS. This is how convoluted this is. So when you hear the UAP task force, and this Grush affair, and my cousin's stamp of approval on it, well, that raises a huge red flag with me. I think they're using the Pentagon denial as controlled opposition. I think they're trying to get a hold of this narrative. After 80 years of subterfuge and skullduggery. They're trying to get the hold of this narrative. And I'll never forget, an admiral once told me in my dad's office, he said, this is when I used to see Bobby Ray Inman in my dad's office. They were all friends. He said, you know, in the future, they're not going to give a damn about whether or not the public knows about crashes or little gray men or tall reptilian men with feathers or, you know, and all this stuff. They don't care about that. They care about keeping the dirty laundry secret. You know, I've grown up in this world. My father showed me how the deep state worked because he took me with him everywhere. Starting at age 8 when he was Undersecretary of the Navy, I went to him with every naval base in the world almost. And I said, what are you doing in Antarctica? I was 14. He'd had a few drinks that night and had an argument with Liz Taylor, who she believed in UFOs and because she saw one off of California with Eddie Fisher. And she says, your dad's hiding something. And I said, I know he is. I know him better than anybody. And so he had a few drinks one night. This is 1976. I was 14. And I said, come on, man. I'm your son. What's going down in Antarctica? That's a long way to go. You can test equipment in Alaska up at the Arctic Circle. What's the big deal? Now, I didn't know the Germans had started going to Antarctica in 1903 and had been going back and back and back. Because the word is, can't prove it, but Admiral Byrd was on a couple of those German expeditions in the 30s as an advisor. So my dad, you know, he said, well, we got sub bases. We're drilling out the ice. You know, we've got to have, the Russians got them, you know, God damn it, you got to counteract the Russians. And he said, you know, and I said, well, okay, why Antarctica is so far away? You know, it's 100 degrees below zero. And he looked up at the night sky. It was Switzerland. And he pointed up. And he just said, space operations. And I didn't think anything of it until I read Nick Cook's book. Plus, I read the MJ-12 documents, showed them to him in '93. That put the fear of the universe in me. And so it's all started to piece together. My grandfather's story, Nick Cook's book, Dr. Greer's work, everything. And I thought, holy shit, no one will ever believe me, but he did. And later on, I asked my dad at the end of his life, I said, I'm going to go forward. And he's like, I urge you to, because your cousin Chris is not telling the truth. He's lying by omission. And when they get up there in 2017, say, this is a mystery. He is lying to the world, him and Louis Elizondo. Bald-faced lie. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. And by the way, something he didn't mention, his grandfather, Paul Mellon, said, no, this is not with the jets. This is an electrogravitic. This is electronic. This is why we call this the lost century. There is at least a century of extraordinary technologies, which if used peacefully and for humanity, will completely transform all life on Earth. And it's one of the reasons why what he was just sharing, Mr. Warner was just sharing, is so important to pull the cover back on, and that's the continuous gaslighting of the media and the Congress on the facts of this, because they simply keep getting manipulated in the media and on Capitol Hill with people going up there telling false narratives and also, as he said, lying by omission when they know better. And I think we have to, as a people, say that's also has to end immediately. And the only way to do it is to expose it. So, now, I want to share some material. We have about half an hour, and we want time for some Q&A, so we're running a little bit late here. But I just want to mention very quickly something I was going to spend a little more time on, and that are the dangers of an unsupervised, rogue, illegal secret government having technologies that involve the scalar aspects. In other words, if you guys can have a seat, please, we're not finished yet. So that we can actually target, this is what you're referring to, in deep space. Now the problem is I warned of this. This was one of the purposes of my briefing of the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, is that I knew then in the 90s that there were systems that were targeting not just UFOs that were in Earth orbit or near Earth, but objects way out in space. And if you understand quantum entanglement, where basically every point in space and time is connected, and you're dealing with scalar systems that have been weaponized for decades, those have been used in an unsupervised way to target places very far out in space of extraterrestrial origin. Now, what's the problem with that scenario? Instead of this issue being handled by scientists, diplomats, and known by the public, it's run by a bunch of rogue people who are like the madman riding the rocket down in the, the Dr. Strangelove, that scientist, for, detonating a nuclear bomb. They simply cannot continue to do this, because at some point, I want to be very careful what I'm saying here, very careful. I do not think there are overtly hostile civilizations out there, but as I said, they are getting fed up with our hostility and operations with their technology, which are now becoming an existential threat way out in space, and I mean beyond our solar system. For that reason, at some point, there's the risk, a grave risk, that these covert programs, if they aren't brought under control, will cross what I call the extraterrestrials' red line, because there is a universal right for them to protect other places. So this is something no one is talking about in the community or on Capitol Hill, and it needs to be talked about. So keep in mind, 75, 80 years of technology, like this SS disk, and you figure on the shoulders of that and the work from the 20s forward into the 40s, and then that combines with studying extraterrestrial material. If you think that there have been no significant breakthroughs beyond the B-2 stealth bomber, you need to have another thing coming. And unfortunately, the legal constitutional government of the United States is not in control of that. There's a Frankenstein illegal secret government, shadow government, that Inouye referred to, that's gotten up and walked away. That has to be absolutely reined in as soon as possible. So I think I want to remind people that all members of Congress and people in the military take an oath. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Domestic. Cool. Yeah. All right. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. Now, with the evidence that we have, there are a set of recommendations that we are making that are very important. If we can put those up. We're recommending that the investigation of the UAP and UFO projects based on disclosure intelligence, archive, and other actionable intelligence commence immediately. That is not actually happening yet, just nominally. Presidential executive order to immediately stand down all targeting and attacks on ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles. An executive order requiring all military and intelligence contractors and other agencies of the U.S. government to disclose to Congress and the White House all information, materiel, technologies, locations of UFO, UAP related assets. If not complied with within 6 months, offending parties should be prosecuted and tried for treason against the United States of America. An executive order to require the State Department and Pentagon to coordinate global diplomatic and peaceful response to extraterrestrial civilizations. An executive order requiring the immediate release of all U.S. Patent Office patents which have been illegally, I should add, seized under the corrupt use of national security provisions. The executive order to immediately require U.S. Space Force and Pentagon to coordinate assets with the State Department, UN, and other foreign governments to initiate protocols for peaceful diplomatic contact with all extraterrestrial civilizations. An executive order to immediately disclose advanced energy generating technologies, zero-point, quantum vacuum, plasma generators, etc., for peaceful use. Electrogravitic, anti-gravity propulsion to remain classified pending review of military applications and national security concerns, because those can be used as weapon system launch platforms. So this is part of what we're going to be recommending, are recommending. And then in the congressional recommendations, the Congress needs to immediately pass $50 billion to support research and development and application of zero-point and related, quote, free energy systems, requiring all research to be open source and disclosed. Amnesty provision for 6 to 12 months of all the whistleblowers and executives, et cetera, who may have committed crimes. So there are people who need to come forward. I've mentioned a few, and they have been criminally culpable, but we need to make this a win-win. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. After this amnesty period, individuals and corporations, both private and governmental, should be vigorously prosecuted. Congress to convene open hearings with whistleblowers and evidence that the Disclosure Project Intelligence Archive is in possession of. And as I mentioned, all that has been conveyed to them as of this past Monday. Congress to pass legislation to explicitly protect personal safety, pensions, and private assets of all whistleblowers. So those are the beginning. So what I'd like to do now is introduce a very wonderful, well, he was a very young man when we met, Derek Garcia. I've mentioned him this weekend several times. He was a student at Wesleyan, I believe, when the Disclosure Project event in 2001 happened. Now he's in his early 40s and an attorney. And he has helped us over the years and is a wonderful, knowledgeable attorney who knows a great deal about this subject. He actually volunteered for the Disclosure Project after that event, if I recall. And he has a very important information to give you about the Disclosure Project Legal Defense Fund and the strategies that we're developing. He has done this also with the help, critically important help of Paige Fox, who's here. Where's Paige? Thank you very much also, because this is an all-volunteer effort. There are dozens of attorneys and other legal professionals who have now at this point offered their services pro bono to help with this undertaking to not only pursue RICO actions in a civilian RICO, but also other actions for private individuals and against corporations and against certain agencies of the United States government, not under RICO, but in separate actions. They are also there to defend all you whistleblowers and people coming forward, because you are no longer bound by your non-disclosure agreements, since we can now prove in a court of law that those projects are criminal and illegal operations. They cannot cite any law to punish you or to restrict you. And if that's attempted, please contact me personally immediately. So with no further ado, Derek Garcia.
Who's ready for the legal fight ahead? Who's ready to get to the bottom of this issue once and for all? My name is Derek Garcia. I'm an attorney of 13 years. I practice in the District of New Mexico, the federal district there. I'm also licensed to practice in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals for the United States, as well as the Supreme Court of the United States. And I'm here today to discuss the Disclosure Project legal team that is now in formation. We made the announcement on May 23rd of this year via YouTube for the formation of a one-of-kind historic legal team that will finally get to the bottom of this issue. With the wonderful help and assistance of Paige Fox, who's been a logistical genius in organizing these attorneys, we are proud to announce that we are now joined by over 35 confirmed attorneys nationally, as well as 24 more volunteers, legal connected volunteers, 12 paralegals, 4 law clerks, and we now have boots on the ground, legal representation for the Disclosure Project legal team in over 20 states across the United States, every relevant jurisdiction. We also have very well-known attorneys internationally in the UK, Australia, and a number of other legal volunteers, pro bono attorneys, civilian lawyers coming forward to finally put an end to this embargo on the truth. I wanted to begin with my first slide. A personal hero of mine, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Sometimes history takes things into its own hands. If I may have the next slide. Disclosure is inevitable at this point. The only question is timing, just how detrimental the climate and environmental damage has to get before we put this issue to bed. This is a one-of-a-kind and non-partisan volunteer legal team in formation. It is designed to be nonpartisan. We welcome Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Independents, Libertarians, across the board. If this is going to get done, it is going to take every sector of the political spectrum, regardless of political affiliation. We want to legitimize the essentially taboo topic heretofore of UFOs and promote public awareness as to the numerous related constitutional and legal issues. We want to support the constitutional government in finally regaining full operational control over these secrets, over these projects and these beyond black projects, which have escaped congressional oversight for far too long. We are going to seek the truth about propulsion and advanced energy technologies capable of immediately solving world hunger, poverty, and the energy crisis that we are faced with. We will seek justice for all those who have been harmed by non-disclosure and UFO secrecy. We are going to seek justice through a variety of legal actions in order to end technology suppression, and we are going to assert legal claims, some of them novel, some of them not quite so novel, against a variety of defendants in multiple jurisdictions. And now, with this legal team coming together, over 80 legal connected volunteers, we are going to see pay dirt. We are going to file actions in multiple jurisdictions on select cases from the Disclosure Project intelligence archives developed over the last 30 years by Dr. Greer and his courageous team. We are going to use the civilian application of the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization Act of 1970, which will allow us to seek 3 times the monetary damages for an individual or an organization that has been harmed by the illegal criminal enterprise behind these issues. We are going to take testimony and present testimony and competent evidence used in RICO lawsuits, which can then be used by assistant United States attorneys, other criminal prosecutors to seek grand jury indictments, and on the list of enumerated crimes that Dr. Greer just went through. And we know that we are capable of enforcement of the same criminal laws through civil action. We're going to use the case of Bivens versus 6 unknown named legal agents, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case that ruled there's an implied cause of action to be extended under the 4th Amendment, which governs illegal searches and seizures. And it says that we have a civil cause of action for whenever anyone's 4th Amendment rights have been violated under law. We know that this has been tried in legal history many times before to extend other amendments in addition to the Fourth Amendment under Bivens, such as the Fifth Amendment, which prohibits unlawful deprivation of property without due process of law relative to the federal government, as well as the First Amendment, the whistleblower actions and all these courageous witnesses over the years with the Disclosure Project that have been retaliated against. We will see justice and seek justice through First Amendment retaliation theory. We will also go to other important rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights, and there are many, many, many rights at stake. If there's any time to argue for an extension of existing law and to apply new legal theories, this is the issue. The UFO ETV issue is the issue of our time. For the first time in history, courts will be required to examine and adjudicate whether certain seizures of technology had a legitimate basis in national security. They will be required to conclusively declare whether a secrecy or a gag order against the government or military personnel were justified, and whether these orders were implemented via legitimate congressional or executive branch authorization and oversight. We can confidently say that no such legal authority exists in the majority of these cases. At the 2001 Disclosure 1.0 press conference, over 400 highly credentialed witnesses first brought to light in Dr. Greer's first book, and during the initial press conference in 2001. These are people with reputations at stake. These are highly credentialed military, government, intelligence witnesses. We will not let them be ignored any longer. Over 750 highly credentialed witnesses in government, intelligence, and the private sector and defense contractors have now been identified. And there are several thousands of ordinary people and lay witnesses documented by the Disclosure Project and other major ETV UFO study organizations to date. These numbers matter. Dr. Greer mentioned the otherwise, unless otherwise, UNOD letter to Congress and the Clinton administration in 1997 and 98. It clearly states that credentialed government and military whistleblowers would be coming forward, and they would offer explosive eyewitness testimony directly related to the UFO ETV issue. No such explicit instructions prohibiting this public disclosure were received back from either the legislative or the executive branch, fully permitting the witness testimony of May 9th, 2001 at the National Press Club, Disclosure Project 1.0. We are going to build on these efforts. We invite you to join our growing legal team. We now number, as I stated earlier, over 80 legal field connected professionals, 35 attorneys, 12 paralegals, 4 law clerks, and numerous law enforcement connected investigators. June 4 was our initial meeting. We have now added to our numbers exponentially, even since that very first meeting. We are capable of filing an action in each relevant jurisdiction in the U.S., in addition to a growing list of international team members. While we cannot say for certain names, we want to protect people's and their names and reputations, especially law clerks. If they work for a judge, it can be quite sensitive. But we are in the process of clearing our courageous volunteers' names for public disclosure, and there are some very, very prestigious attorneys who have signed on for this one-of-a-kind and historic effort. We need attorneys with experience in civil rights, national security, criminal prosecutions, criminal defense for alleged violation of NDAs and or illegal secrecy oaths and clearances. We encourage everyone to show up, suit up, and stand up for your country and the world. Under the RICO statute, it will be our burden to prove the existence of a criminal enterprise. And as a first bit of personal testimony regarding my own personal experience, I offer a small piece of the story. I was a young Capitol Hill intern in 2001 when the May 9th Disclosure Project 1.0 press conference hit. It had recently aired at that time, and it was the largest internet broadcast in history at that time, even with the suspected jamming that was going on and suppression techniques later testified to by the personnel at Connect Live. Unfortunately, much of the event seemed to be buried in print-only stories in the back, of the major media stories of the day, without featuring any video of the numerous witnesses and without conducting any follow-up interviews of the numerous government witnesses, including a highly ranked Brigadier General, Stephen Lufkin, I think mentioned earlier, astronauts, an FAA division chief, a DIA intelligence official, former NASA contractor, and numerous others, highly credible witnesses, totaling over 400 credentialed witnesses at that time. To quote one of my personal heroes and a hero of American history, Senator Daniel Inouye, there exists a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances and free from the law itself. I, as a young Capitol Hill intern, I thought, surely he must be joking. Surely he must be exaggerating. I have recently executed an affidavit. It might be a little hard to read for members here in person. During my internship, I distributed numerous copies of the Disclosure Project Executive Summary and written materials to various members of Congress and their staff, including direct submissions to Senators Lieberman, McCain, Jeffords, Feinstein, Wellstone, Miller, Broad, Clinton, and Senator Warner. And mostly while they were traveling to and from roll call votes on the Senate floor in the underground subway system. A copy of the Disclosure Project Executive Summary and briefing document, similar to what was distributed in 2001, is archived and available through this link in the affidavit. We were waiting in the hallway, the Hart Senate office building. I encountered Senator Daniel Inouye. And I asked him, I put a copy of the executive summary and briefing document into his hand. And I said to him, Senator, have you heard of the Disclosure Project? Have you heard of Dr. Stephen Greer? Have you heard, what do you think about the UFO TV issue? He tucks the summary under his arm and he does one of these to me. He signals me back to his office. So immediately I begin to follow. We get back to his office and he clears some conversations that he was having with other staffers and other appointments, closes the door of his private office and says, I dealt with the UFO issue quite extensively when I was chairman of the Intelligence Committee in 1976. So clearly a lot of history here. We get to talking more and I ask him, well, what do you think about the Disclosure Project? And he confirmed to me that he had seen the May 9th, 2001 Disclosure Project press conference. He confirmed to me directly that many UFOs and projects related to such, in fact, represented genuine extraterrestrial vehicles, and that this issue, as portrayed by Dr. Stephen Greer and the 2000 Disclosure Project witnesses, was not only real, genuine, it was very much not a hoax. I asked Senator Inouye if it was true that a secret, unacknowledged government was the control group on this, outside the congressional authorized authority of the United States. He says to me that not only is it true, but the Congress doesn't have real control over this issue. He confirmed that he was not exaggerating when he mentioned the shadow government from the Iran-Contra hearings, I believe in 1987. I asked whether he was exaggerating. Surely he must be exaggerating. I thought perhaps he was speaking about another foreign government, not our own. He said he was not exaggerating, that the illegal shadow government what's been termed the ISG, did exist at the time of making the statement and continued to exist in 2001 during our conversation, and that this entity had thus far escaped complete scrutiny, control, and oversight. This is a picture of me as a young Capitol Hill intern in the summer of 2001, trying to get the word out about the Disclosure Project. Next slide, please. A quote from U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts: "You can't fight for your rights if you don't know what they are in the first place." Precisely this situation. I just wanted to say a few brief words about the news media. You don't need a law license to ask questions. Producers, editors, reporters, anchors, media personalities, social media influencers, and all other members of the major media or local news organizations ask why the news and other media organizations did not interview Brigadier General Stephen Lovekin on this issue, for instance. Very highly ranked, very credible. Why are they not digging deep? Hundreds and hundreds of Disclosure Project witnesses, yet they are willing to broadly report on superficial UFO research. Why are they not reporting on the Disclosure Project events in a serious and comprehensive way, at least in 2001? Every citizen is a potential witness or an attorney's investigator on this issue. You don't need a law license to ask questions. We believe that the major media blockade exists for two primary reasons. As Dr. Greer and Dr. Carol Rosen have stated, the rest of the Disclosure Project team, they have consistently refused to advance the threat narrative that extraterrestrial civilizations are somehow a threat to the human race, and they refuse to support the militarization of space based on this false threat. Second, the Disclosure Project team has consistently linked the UFO ETV issue to suppressed information on advanced energy, electrogravitics, and propulsion technology that, once disclosed, will help resolve the environmental crisis by alleviating the need for coal, oil, and fossil fuels. Lies by omission, incomplete and fraudulent journalism. Dr. Greer is the only one, in my experience, who has consistently talked about energy and the connection. Dr. Greer is the only one who has refused to even speculate about the false threat narrative. Those two reasons, for those two reasons alone, I don't think he's appeared in the major media since the Larry King live show in the 90s. They know the message that he carries, and there's a reason he doesn't get the same media airplay.
Thank you. Anita. Thank you. There's more to do, but we are running quite late. What is this? Nurse? Such helpless babies, aren't we, guys? Anyway, I just want to make a quick comment. The CE5 Contact Program is a grassroots diplomatic effort to reach out to these civilizations. You can get the CE5 Contact app. This has, of course, garnered me the most ridicule, et cetera, and so on, and from the, I call it the Flat Earth Society of Scientists, who think that the field consciousness research of Dr. John and others is bogus. It is not. That the remote viewing programs at the CIA were bogus. They were not. They had results. And that these civilizations are still using iPhones or something on board those craft that are at the speed of light, and they're not. The fact is that we're dealing with civilizations whose technologies, including communication systems, are in the thousands and in some cases millions of years past ours. We have to keep a very open mind about why the CE5 contact events have happened, how are they happening, and what is the new paradigm in physics and the cosmology that explains it. Now, I just wanted to show a couple of these. This is an ET, we call him the healer, who appeared at Oracle a couple years ago. You can see the face is sort of in the shadow. It teleported in beside the man that you see on the left side of the screen in the shadow. And that man had had a lifelong hearing loss since middle school, could barely hear anything. And he asked this ET later that night to help. And the ET healed him. The next morning, he woke up in a 100% normal hearing. Threw away his $5,000 hearing aid. This is an actual photograph, not retouched. Next. This is a being that was a very advanced civilization on the beach in front of us, crystalline form, teleported in. This civilization is in the order of, in the millions of years, further developed than humans. And we know this civilization. Next. And here are some objects taken by a CE5 member from a plane who was doing the contact protocols over Nevada in 2012. Next. And this is another huge, look at this object. This is an infrared Joshua tree up above us. After all satellites were no longer visible, you can see the two bright objects, but then there is a superstructure in between that was moving over the area, I think 3 of the 6 nights we were there. Next. And then this is my favorite, Raven, my assistant here took in Joshua Tree in 2009. And this is the wide angle on the left. You see barely on the edge, an orb, the lights that are on the chairs that we had vacated for a break. And then you zoom in, next slide, you'll see this guy. His name is Bijou, a Nellis reconnaissance and retrieval team member, had a contact experience with this particular ET not too long ago. And it was very interesting because you have to remember, if you have the ability to move faster than the speed of light, you're involving trans-dimensional technologies where you can teleport, move in and out of space-time. And so our camera guys and ladies have learned how to have settings where they can capture these, even if they're not all the time 3D in front of us. They're very advanced concepts in photography. We don't have time to go in. And next.
All right, Dr. Greer, what percentage of our government is aware of the secret program Black Budget? Is this a lack of awareness or is it an issue of fear?
I would say that extremely few people know about the illegal aspects of this budget, right? So let's be clear. There's the Black Budget that's legal. It's overseen by select members of the House and the Senate and the White House and National Security folks. That's different. There's always been, for many decades, a legal Black budget. This was Snowden's mistake. Even though there was an appalling program, he disclosed projects which were properly being overseen. We're not talking about that. Now, how do I know that? Because I'm dealing with people who manage the Black budget legally on behalf of the Congress, and they are absolutely been shut out of this. So have the members of Congress, just as Senator Inouye shared with Derek Garcia. So I think there has to be a clear demarcation in people's minds between legal, covert, TSSCI, Black Project. Those are not illegal if they're properly overseen. When you cross the line, rogue, illegal, it means you are denying access, you're engaging in criminal activities, you're blocking the White House and President and Congress from knowing things. You cannot do that and pretend you're a part of a democratic republic.
Okay, Dr. Greer, can you speculate what would be the purpose of flying these anti-grav airships above populated areas if the notion is that these are supposed to be super secret Black programs?
Because they're trying to do an acculturation program so that people think everything that goes bump in the night that they don't know what it is, it's not a B-2 stealth or 747, is alien. This is part of the psychological warfare program that CI Director Smith in 1953 described. So you launch these things, same thing with our military. You know, when I talked to David Fravor, the F-18 Hornet pilot there that chased this object off the coast of San Diego, he made it clear to me there's no way we humans, have anything that moves like that. On the contrary, I said. But he said, no, it can't be. He just couldn't believe it. But the problem is, if you're a jet pilot, I don't care if you're a U-2 pilot, if you are not read into those projects, you don't know about it. But this is dangerous. Good point here. is that the public can be deceived, but equally, or perhaps more importantly, our military command has been deceived, as I mentioned yesterday. This is operationally very dangerous to have these sort of things go on. And like I mentioned, that this Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Command, Harry Train, was completely blindsided by that event that Merle Shane McDowell, one of our disclosure witnesses, has testified to. So over the public, these events can happen over populated areas because they want to get people aware that these are real, UFOs are real, but in an acculturated way. But in a sense, with the narrative that gets pushed to the forefront in the media and the subculture of ufology as an alien threat. So this is part of the preparation for people to give up their rights and their freedoms to accept a threat from outer space. It's a long-term project, and we're coming to a head on it, which is why we need to get that narrative back, and we need the Congress to tell the truth and the media to begin to tell the truth.
Okay, do other Earth governments react the same way to their forces that have seen secret things?
The answer is that this group, that is this illegal secret government complex, is transnational. Remember I said the first day, transnational means not international, where you have embassy to embassy or president to prime minister. It's transnational, but it's global. So the first time I went into the skiff up here in DC, and I said, see that map of the world over your head? Erase every geopolitical line between Canada, United States, Russia, China, Poland, etc. Doesn't exist for this operation. It absolutely does not exist. They move around the world. How else were they in Indonesia running this project? They do it with alacrity and with the hubris of a full control over the situation because of their technological superiority. So the same structure that I described that goes on here goes on in Canada, United Kingdom, France, etc. I have less intelligence on Russia and China, but certainly Japan and all the other countries, and also in South America. How else could the CIA, from the document Dr. Jacques Vallée have operations in Argentina and Brazil abducting civilians to make it look like aliens were doing it for its psychological warfare, which is what the document says. We're going to sue to get that document, by the way. You should all have it. I've been denied it so far, but we will get it. Yeah.
Okay, what is the goal of having all this advanced tech and not using it?
I actually think the purpose is to release the ones that give them greater control over the populace. In other words, internet technologies, fiber optic, certain other things have been out because those allow them to build their surveillance state and control. The ones that would actually, I call it power to the people, where you would actually have something that would run your house and your car from 0 point free energy, those are ones that would take the power that's concentrated and disperse it to the entire population, where everyone would literally be independent and free to have energy and be developed. There is also, I think, an unfortunate other motive here, and that is the have and the have-nots concept. And the idea that, you know, we have 3 billion people on the planet who don't have any way to cook their food. As The Economist just came out with this statistic last year. And so they're cutting down rainforest and woods and areas with scrubs and desert just to be able to have a way to cook. 48% of the population of the planet doesn't have indoor plumbing. Now, how do you solve that problem? You're not going to solve it with solar panels or windmills. You can solve it with these technologies. But if you do that, literally the power that is in the current banking, petrodollar, energy sector system and all their associated industries would then flow to the people. And so this would be the largest macroeconomic change in the history, known history of the human species. And so to hold on to that power, that centralized power, global elite power, almost anything will be done by this group.
Okay, in listening to many astronauts' firsthand accounts of structures or at least anomalies on the moon, Mars moon, possibly Mars, Are these structures there? And if so, how did it happen? And what are the implications for humanity?
They are there, as you know. Carl Wolf, who was at a National Security Agency a compartmented operation at Langley Air Force Base in 1968, as we were going around the moon taking the early digital photographs, he was shown these structures. It's not a myth. I have also had it confirmed by scientists at the Goddard Space Flight Center that some of the images that came back from the early Mars images did show pyramid and other shaped objects and debris clearly that are ancient. Now, my understanding is those were very, very, very old, but on the moon, there were some structures that are fairly new, and I have spoken to a Navy SEAL who was for 2 weeks on a project where they were going back and forth with these electrogravitics out to that moon base, which is a classified facility on the moon. But in the early days, of course, there were only the debris of evidence of a prior visitation. And think on Mars, a civilization that may have gone the direction that the extraterrestrials right now are trying to prevent us from going. Because many civilizations have reached exactly where we are, they become extinct, blow themselves up, get into wars, endless wars, biosphere destruction, etc. So this is why we are at an existential crisis. And it's not going to be solved by the old thinking. It has to be solved by new thinking.
Okay, you have room for one more?
One more.
Okay. In NASA's Artemis program, NASA's return to the moon to repeat of the Apollo program, is this proxy for a new Cold War?
Well, all those efforts that are going, most of them are, of course, really being done in the private sector. They have to understand that the technologies they're using, of course, SpaceX and all of them, are circa 1940s Werner von Braun, with just better computer systems and what have you. But obviously those projects, in my opinion, are to keep up the appearance that we're actually doing something with space. And it's sort of a diversion. Now, in all honesty, my uncle, who worked on the lunar module, he was not read in to the Northrop Grumman projects dealing with this. So I think most of the people in NASA and in those companies think they're doing the right thing with the technologies they have access to, even though they're using 75, 80-year-old technology that was Werner von Braun's rocket system in a more sophisticated way. They're not knowing this. It's unfortunate, but that's, again, the failure of the press and the government to bring these technologies forward for peaceful use. Whether or not there is another agenda there, I have no personal knowledge of. I just think that it's misguided, and there are much better ways to go to the moon and elsewhere than firing rockets that are damaging the upper atmosphere.